The wind scoured the plains as if trying to erase what had once stood there. A lone cottonwood tree, twisted and blackened by lightning, marked the edge of the trail like a scar left too long unhealed. Snow had come early to the high country, not in the soft hush of winter, but in shards of wind-driven ice, stinging the face and dragging the breath from the lungs. The horse moved slow beneath him, head down, steam rising off its flanks. The saddle creaked. That was the only sound besides the wind. He hadn't slept in 2 nights, hadn't eaten in 1. His hands were cracked, the blood dried in the seams of his knuckles. The boy behind him hadn't spoken in hours, just held on with arms too thin for the weather, his small face buried in the back of his coat. His name was Isaac, 6 years old. That was all the cowboy knew for certain. The land fell away ahead of them, a pale stretch of white to the horizon. There was no sign of the widow's homestead, not even smoke. Only the carcass of a barn they'd passed at first light, half collapsed under snow, with crows hopping along its rafters like it was a church long ago abandoned. His name was Will, just Will. Folks back in Colorado Springs had known him once, ranch hand, gambler, brief husband, briefer father, but none of that mattered now. He rode west, not for work, not for glory, but because there was nowhere left to go. The war inside him had outlasted the one the papers printed. He had buried too many things too deep, but now the boy was here, quiet and cold, and he could not outride that truth. A sudden gust flung snow against his face. He turned the horse toward a small rise. There, tucked in the bend of the hill, half covered in drifts, was a house, or what remained of one, roof sagging, door off its hinges, smoke-blackened stone chimney standing straight as a soldier, even if the home it had warmed was long past warmth. Will stopped the horse. He felt Isaac stir behind him, a low whimper escaping his throat. Will slid down, first boots crunching through crusted snow, then reached up and pulled the boy down. The child's coat was too thin, patched in places with burlap, and his mittens were mismatched. One was wool, the other leather, both soaked through. The door gave way with a groan. Inside, the air was bitter with ash and silence. A rusted stove stood in the corner, the belly of it empty. Will set Isaac down by the wall and knelt to check the stove's pipe. Still open. That was something. Outside, he chopped from the edge of the collapsed barn, hands stiff and aching. Isaac watched through a crack in the wall, legs pulled tight beneath him. Will built the fire, slow feeding it slivers of pine until the stove began to tick with heat. He did not speak. Words felt too big for the quiet. As the fire warmed the room, Isaac edged closer, his eyes wide and unsure. Will took a tin cup from his saddlebag, melted snow into it, and let the boy drink. There was jerky, too hard as bark, but enough to chew on. It was the first full meal Isaac had had since the stagecoach overturned near Larkspur, spilling passengers into snow and silence. Will had found him 2 days later beside the body of his mother, whose hands were curled around her son, even in death. Will had not meant to take the boy. He'd meant to bury the woman, leave word with the county office, and ride on. But Isaac had looked up at him and said nothing, just stared, his mouth dry, his eyes unblinking. Will had seen that look before, in mirrors, in dreams. Now, as twilight fell across the prairie, painting the snow in bruised blue and gray, Will sat beside the stove, listening to the fire and the boy's breathing. The wind whistled through cracks in the boards, but inside it was still. A stillness that hurt to feel. "Papa," the boy whispered. Will's eyes opened. "They got no place," the boy said. His voice was hoarse, almost unsure. Will turned, unsure what the boy meant. Outside, at the edge of the clearing, 2 figures stood in the falling dark. A woman in a shawl, her skirt torn at the hem. A girl beside her, maybe 12, her hands clenched into fists. Refugees from the road. Like him. like all of them. Will stood slowly, every bone in his body screaming against the cold, the loss, the weariness. But he walked to the door, and this time he opened it. The woman didn't move. Neither did the girl. They stood half sunk in the snow clothes, stiff with cold faces, windburned. Behind them nothing but white. No wagon. No mule. No footprints except their own, already half swallowed by the storm. Will stepped out into the cold. His coat flared in the wind, but he didn't fasten it. He looked at the woman, then past her to the empty horizon. This wasn't a mistake. They hadn't lost their way. This was the end of wherever they'd come from. She finally spoke. "We was told there was a town this way." Her voice was dry as sagebrush cracked at the edges. "There was no town. Not for 50 miles west, and it was no town worth reaching." Will shook his head. She nodded like she expected as much. Then she lowered her gaze. "We got nothing," she said. "Only our legs left." Will's hands tightened at his sides. There was a part of him that still wanted to say nothing, to turn and close the door. Survival taught you to guard warmth like it was gold. He could feel that instinct, sharp and ugly, but behind him inside the cabin Isaac had stood and was watching. Will stepped aside. The girl looked to her mother, uncertain, then took the first step. The snow crunched. Will held the door as they passed, the smell of travel on them, sweat and dirt and fear. The girl said thank you in a voice that was more habit than hope. Inside the heat was thin, but better than nothing. The woman sank near the stove with a quiet groan, pulling the girl close. Will didn't speak. He just went to the saddlebag and tore the last piece of jerky and half-handed one piece to the girl. She hesitated but took it. Isaac watched from the shadows, a quilt around his shoulders. His eyes stayed on Will. Will stirred the fire with a piece of iron he'd found under the stove. Flames licked higher, catching the dry pine. He didn't ask the woman's name. Didn't offer his. Names came later, if at all. But he saw her glance around the cabin the same way he had, measuring the damage, what was usable, what could be made to last. She was like him. Someone who'd lost more than could be counted. Someone who still had someone else to keep warm. That night he sat against the wall while the others slept. The woman and her girl huddled beneath the same quilt, and Isaac curled beside him, one hand resting against Will's arm in his sleep. He listened to the fire and the wind and the old bones of the house creaking in the cold. Something inside him moved, but slow. Like a thaw. Like spring still weeks off, but making its quiet promise. By morning the sky was clearing. The kind of cold blue that cut sharp as a blade but meant the storm had passed. Will stepped outside, breath rising in plumes, boots sinking deep in snow. He walked the edge of the clearing, taking in the barn again. One beam had fallen clean through the roof, but the rest could be salvaged. With work. With time. He'd known the place once. Long ago. Belonged to a man named Grady, an old hand who taught him how to break horses without breaking their spirit. Grady had died a few winters back, and no one came to claim the land. Will had nearly forgotten. He kicked at a drift and found the old water pump. Still frozen but not rusted through. Inside he found the woman standing. She had wrapped her shawl tighter, her eyes steady now. "I can help patch the roof," she said, "if you'll let me earn what we use." Will nodded. Not because he agreed, but because he understood. Pride had a place, even in hunger. Maybe especially then. "I'll start on the barn," he said. She looked at him a moment, then nodded once and started gathering broken boards from the corners of the room. The girl helped without being told. By mid-morning the place sounded like life. Wood splitting. Snow being shoveled. Fire crackling. Isaac stood in the doorway watching. Will looked up from the snow and saw him there. "You best get inside," he said. Isaac just smiled. "No, Papa," he said. "I'm helpin'." The trail remembers, subscribe, and learn why. The days passed slow, stitched together by cold mornings and long silences. Each breath hung in the air like smoke from an old gun barrel. They worked in layers, sleeves rolled up, eyes down. Will and the woman barely spoke, unless there was need, but something passed between them, acknowledgement, respect, a hard-earned quiet that didn't need softening. Her name was Ruth. He learned it 3 days in, when the girl skinned her hand lifting a beam, and Ruth called out sharp and worried. The girl's name was Elsie. She was quick, wiry, full of the kind of strength you only saw in those raised by loss. The four of them made slow progress. Will patched the roof with salvaged planks from the barn, hands raw and bleeding by nightfall. Ruth cleaned out the house, beat the mold from blankets, hung what could be saved. Elsie and Isaac hauled water in buckets once the pump thawed their small boots, leaving crooked paths across the yard. No one said it, but they had become a unit, a shape made from necessity. One night, when the wind eased and the moon threw light across the floor, Will sat by the stove while Ruth boiled a tin of beans, stretching the last of what they had. The fire cast long shadows on her face. Her eyes looked older than her years, and he wondered who she'd been before the road, before this frozen patch of nowhere. "I was married once," she said, not looking up. "He went north with a freight job. Promised to send for us. That was 2 winters ago." Will didn't answer right away. He listened to the wood shift in the stove. "He send word?" he asked. "No." The beans bubbled. She stirred slow. "You—" He thought of answering. Thought of giving her names, his wife, the child buried in the hills outside Trinidad, but he didn't. He just shook his head. Ruth nodded like she understood that too. That night, after the children were asleep, he stepped outside and looked up at the sky. Stars scattered across the black like dust on coal. A coyote called far off, mournful and thin. Will wrapped his coat tighter and walked the edge of the clearing again. The barn could hold livestock if they could get hands on some. The pump still groaned but worked. The house had 4 walls mostly. The bones were good. That's what Grady had always said, look to the bones. Everything else could be fixed. Inside, Ruth sat with Elsie's head in her lap, running her fingers through the girl's hair. She looked up as Will returned, her face soft but guarded. He paused at the door, not out of doubt, but habit. A lifetime of waiting to be turned away. "Come in, Will," she said. She didn't smile. Didn't have to. In the mornings, Ruth took to boiling snow to wash clothes, sleeves rolled to her elbows, fingers red from cold. Will watched her from the barn, the way she moved with purpose. She was a woman used to making things last, to stretching what little was left. Not out of fear, but out of knowing better than to count on the world to provide. He started showing Isaac how to sandboards, how to line nails straight. The boy listened like his life depended on it. Maybe it did. Ruth showed Elsie how to make a broth from dried roots they found near the stream, taught her how to mend socks and check for mice behind the walls. They were surviving. And more than that, changing. One afternoon, Will caught himself laughing. A sharp sound cracked from disuse. Isaac had dropped a tin pail and it bounced off his boot with such perfect aim that Will couldn't help it. The boy blinked, unsure at first, then grinned wide. Ruth looked up from where she was mending a saddle strap, and for the first time Will saw a trace of something warm in her surprise, maybe. Or relief. By the end of the week, the barn stood half-righted. Smoke rose steady from the chimney each morning. There was rhythm. Not peace exactly, but presence. And then, on the 7th day, the stranger came. Rode in slow, lean, and the saddle coat long and dust-covered. Will spotted him at the edge of the ridge where the snow had melted just enough to show hoof prints. He stepped outside, rifle in hand, but held low. The stranger reined in, raised a hand. "I'm looking for Ruth," he said. Ruth Lark. Inside, Ruth froze. Her hands tightened on the table's edge. The girl stood confused. Will turned eyes hard. Ruth stepped past him before he could say a word. Her voice was steady, but her face had gone white. "Hello, Thomas." The man dismounted with the care of someone who'd ridden far. His boots crunched over frost-hardened dirt as he approached. Will stayed close, rifle still in hand. Ruth didn't flinch. She stood tall, arms crossed tight against her chest, not from cold. Thomas removed his hat. His hair was longer than it ought to be, streaked with dust and a bit of gray. Lines ran deep across his face, but his eyes were the same pale blue as Elsie's. "I see you're still breathing," Ruth said. Thomas gave a slow nod. "Barely. Looking for you took what little I had left." Will didn't speak, but he stepped forward, closing the space between them just enough. Ruth noticed. Her voice sharpened. "What do you want, Thomas?" The girl stayed behind her, silent eyes locked on the man. She didn't move toward him, didn't call him father. That told Will enough. Thomas looked down, thumbed the brim of his hat. "I came to bring you back. You left us. I had my reasons." Ruth's voice dropped. "You had a promise." Thomas shifted, hands clenched tight. "I made mistakes, Ruth. I ain't denying that. But I never stopped looking. The world's been turning without us, and I can't keep going knowing you're out here alone." "We're not alone," Ruth said, quiet but certain. That hit him. His eyes flicked to Will, to the rifle, to the smoke rising from the chimney behind them, to the girl standing just out of reach. "I ain't here for a fight," Thomas said, raising both hands. "I ain't got the right. I just came to see her face again. Say what needed saying. If you tell me to ride on, I will." A silence settled, stretched long and tight. Will looked to Ruth. He wouldn't speak for her, wouldn't decide what came next. She looked at Thomas, then at Elsie, then past them both to the hills behind. When she spoke, her voice was raw. "She waited. Every day. Thought maybe you were dead. I let her believe it 'cause it was easier than saying you left us on purpose." "I didn't," Thomas started, but she raised a hand. "You did. Maybe not with Haiti. Maybe not with joy. But you went. And we stayed. That's all the truth a child needs." Thomas dropped his gaze. "I thought I'd make it. Get enough saved, come back and build something, but the job folded and I got caught in Cheyenne too long, then got jumped outside of Sheridan. Spent 3 months in a sickbed thinking I'd never see a road again. That was last year. What about the rest of it?" He said nothing. His silence was the answer. Will lowered the rifle just slightly. Ruth turned to Elsie. "Do you want to speak with him?" The girl's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. "No," she said, her voice small but firm. Thomas blinked like the words struck harder than he'd prepared for. He nodded. "I understand." He looked to Will again, and this time his voice carried something like respect. "You watch out for them." Will said nothing, just nodded once. Thomas put his hat back on, back toward his horse. The wind picked up again, scattering dust over snow. Ruth stepped forward. "You lost your right to call her yours, but I hope you find peace out there." "I truly do." Thomas mounted slow and stiff. "You too," he said, barely above the wind. Then he turned and rode. Never looked back. Inside, Ruth sank onto the bench near the stove. Her hands trembled just once before she tucked them beneath her shawl. Will sat across from her. Not close, not far. He didn't say she'd done right. She didn't ask. Outside, Elsie watched the trail until the rider disappeared into the hills. She whispered, "He still looks the same." Isaac stood beside her and took her hand. That night the fire burned low and no one spoke much. But the silence didn't feel as heavy as before. Something had shifted. A shadow passed. Not gone, but no longer growing. Will stood at the door before bed, eyes on the stars. Ruth stepped beside him. She didn't speak, just looked out over the land. After a long while she said, "You stayed." He nodded. "I reckon I did." The snow melted slow that year, and the thaw brought mud thick clinging on us. Nothing stayed clean. Not boots, not hands, not hearts. But the cold lifted, and with it came a kind of stillness that wasn't absence anymore. It was room. Room to breathe. Room to build. By late March, the pump gave clean water again, and the roof held through a full day of rain. Will fixed the barn doors. Ruth patched the windows with old shirts and flour paste. They planted a line of potatoes in the back stretch of dirt, and when the sun warmed it just enough, they added 2 rows of onions. It was hardly a farm, but it was a start. Ruth moved like she had purpose again. She took to waking early, hair braided, tight, eyes clear. She taught Elsie how to use a needle for more than patching real stitches, straight and patient for shirts worth wearing. She had a soft hum sometimes under her breath when she worked. Will never asked the tune, but he liked the sound of it. Will found himself walking to the ridge, more often checking for signs of travelers, of danger, of anything that might shake what they were making. Each time he came back to the cabin lighter. Not safe, maybe, but less ready to run. One afternoon, Isaac tugged at his sleeve while Will mended a fence post. "Papa," he said, "can I call you that, even if it ain't true?" Will stopped. Looked down at the boy, his hair still wild, cheeks flushed, eyes wide with hope. He didn't answer right away. "You can call me whatever feels right," he said, "but I'll answer to it." Isaac beamed and wrapped his arms around his waist. Will stood stiff for a second, then rested a hand on the boy's back, unsure what it meant to be someone's father again, but willing to learn. That night Ruth set a jar of honey on the table, a gift from a trader passing through. She poured hot water over dried herbs and passed the mugs around. "Feels like spring's comin' for real," she said, smiling for the first time without hesitation. Elsie nodded. "Maybe we can get a chicken or 2. Maybe a milk goat," Ruth added, half laughing. Will raised an eyebrow. "You plannin' to run a farm out here?" Ruth looked at him across the table, serious now. "I'm plannin' to stay." He nodded once. "Then we'll make it hold." Later, after the children had gone to bed, Ruth stepped outside to where Will sat whittling on the stoop. The stars were sharp again, like glass laid out across black silk. She wrapped her shawl tighter and sat beside him. "You mean to stay too?" she asked, voice low. Will turned the bit of wood in his hands. "I never stayed nowhere long," he said, "but I keep thinking about this place. The sound of the pump when it works. That ridge at sunrise. The way Isaac runs when he thinks nobody's watching." He looked at her. "So I guess I'm staying, Ruth, if you'll have me." She didn't answer, just leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat like that a long time, not speaking, just breathing. Spring came all at once after that. The land bloomed quick and defiant. Patches of green shot up like they'd been waiting for the courage to show themselves. Birds returned loud and unruly. A rabbit chewed through the onion sprouts and had to be chased off with a broom, Ruth shouting, hair half down, laughing. Will caught himself thinking some mornings that he hadn't known what peace felt like until now. Not quiet, not solitude, but peace, the kind that comes with work, with purpose, with someone at your side who sees the world the same way. One warm evening, Isaac and Elsie danced around the fire pit while Ruth clapped her hands to keep rhythm. Will watched from the steps, a plate of fresh cornbread in his lap, and something settled inside him for good. He'd been a drifting man, a broken one, but that was no longer the story. The story was a boy who wouldn't let go. A woman who said no and meant it. A girl with fists clenched and head high. A man who turned back when every part of him was trained to keep writing. The story was this: a cabin with smoke rising, a field with roots taking hold, a future still unwritten but finally theirs. Stay with the journey. Subscribe and ride on.